Hey guys, tonight we pull back the curtain on a different kind of history, true crime. We're not venturing into the realm of violent mysteries or unsolved vanishings, but into the world of a crime so audacious, so meticulously planned, and so brilliantly executed that it was hailed as the crime of the century. This is a story not of darkness and terror, but of clockwork precision, old-school gangster cool, and a heist that seemed, for a time, to be the perfect victimless score. We're traveling back to Boston in 1950, a city of tough neighborhoods, waterfront rackets, and a deeply entrenched criminal underworld. This is an era of fedoras and trench coats, a time before high-tech alarms and digital surveillance, when a job could still be pulled off with guts, timing, and a healthy dose of inside information. This is the story of a gang of thieves who took on the most fortified commercial institution in America and, for a while, got away with it. So before you settle in, think about the perfect plan, the one where every detail is accounted for, every contingency met. This is a story about that plan. It's a real-life Ocean's 11, a tale that blurs the line between crime and craftsmanship. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to dive into a world where the crooks were as professional as the cops. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to know who's joining us on these journeys into the past. Now dim the lights, let the world outside fade. Tonight, we're casing a joint in the north end of Boston. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Great Brinks robbery. Our story begins in the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of Boston's North End in the late 1940s. This was the world of small-time hustlers, bookies, and career criminals, a tight-knit community with its own codes and its own loyalties. In this world, a man named Anthony "Tony" Pino was a well-known figure. Pino was not a violent gangster or a mob boss. He was a thinker, a planner, a man who specialized in burglary and safecracking. He was a career criminal, but he saw himself as a professional, an artist of the underworld. For years, Pino had been obsessed with one particular target, a place he viewed as the ultimate score, the Fort Knox of Boston. It was the headquarters of the Brinks Armored Car Company, located at the corner of Prince and Commercial Streets in the North End. The Brinks building was a fortress, a place where millions of dollars in cash, checks, and securities from businesses all over New England were brought each day to be counted and sorted. It was, by all appearances, an impenetrable target. But Tony Pino was a patient man. For nearly 2 years, he dedicated himself to studying the Brinks building. He would watch it for hours from a tenement window across the street, meticulously logging the comings and goings of the armored cars, the schedules of the guards, the patterns of the employees. He memorized every detail. He learned that the building's security, while seemingly formidable, had weaknesses. The alarms were old, the routines were predictable, and the human element was the most vulnerable of all. Pino began to assemble a team, a crew of specialists handpicked from Boston's criminal elite. He needed men he could trust, professionals who wouldn't crack under pressure. He recruited Joseph Specs O'Keefe, a tough, seasoned criminal who would become his right-hand man. He brought in Stanley Gus Gusciora and Vincent Vinny Costa, 2 skilled burglars. The team grew to include 7 other men, each with a specific skill set: drivers, lookouts, muscle. In total, it was a crew of 11 men, a perfectly balanced team for the perfect crime. Their planning was astonishingly meticulous. They broke into the Brinks building no fewer than 6 times in the months leading up to the heist, always at night, always undetected. They would silently pick the locks, disable the alarms, and walk the corridors, learning the layout of the building. They made copies of the keys. They took the cylinders out of the locks on 5 different doors, including the main vault, and had a locksmith unknowingly create perfect duplicates. They then returned the original cylinders to the doors, leaving no trace of their intrusion. They rehearsed the job over and over again, timing their movements down to the second. They knew which doors had alarms and how to bypass them. They knew where the employees would be working in the counting room. They knew the schedule of the guards. They had a complete blueprint of the operation. Their plan was one of stealth and precision, not violence. They would not use guns to intimidate or harm anyone. Their only weapons would be the element of surprise and the psychological power of a perfectly executed plan. They created a uniform for themselves: navy blue pea coats, chauffeurs' caps, and rubber Halloween masks to conceal their identities. They wanted to look like a professional, disciplined unit. Finally, after nearly 2 years of planning and reconnaissance, they were ready. They chose their moment perfectly. The evening of January 17th, 1950. It was a cold, dark Boston night. The timing was crucial. They knew that the day's receipts would have been brought into the counting room, but that the employees would be close to finishing their shift. At 6:55 p.m., 7 members of the crew, led by Tony Pino, pulled up in a stolen truck near the Brinks building. They donned their uniforms and their masks. They used their copied keys to silently let themselves into the building. The other 4 members of the crew acted as lookouts and getaway drivers. Inside, they moved with the quiet confidence of men who had been there many times before. They knew exactly where to go. They silently bypassed the alarms and made their way to the second floor, to the counting room. The 5 Brinks employees inside the counting room had no idea what was about to happen. Suddenly, the door burst open, and 7 masked figures entered the room. They were not carrying guns. They were carrying revolvers, but they were never fired. They also carried rope and adhesive tape. One of the thieves announced, "This is a stick-up." The employees, stunned and terrified, were ordered to lie face down on the floor. The thieves worked quickly and professionally. They bound the employees' hands behind their backs and placed tape over their mouths. They were not harmed, but they were completely neutralized. While some of the crew stood guard over the employees, the others went to work on the vault. But this was the part they had rehearsed the most. The vault door was already open, as the employees had been working inside it. They walked into the massive steel cage that held the city's money. They found several large metal boxes filled with cash, checks, money orders, and securities. They ignored the checks and securities, which would be too difficult to trace and fence. They focused on the cash. They stuffed canvas bags with stacks of bills. They worked quickly, efficiently, and silently. Their haul was staggering. In a matter of minutes, they had collected over $1.2 million in cash and another $1.5 million in other securities. In today's money, it would be a haul of over $30 million. At 7:30 p.m., just 35 minutes after they had entered the building, the job was done. The 7 men walked out of the Brinks building, carrying their heavy bags of cash. They got into their getaway truck and disappeared into the Boston night. They had pulled it off. They had committed the largest single cash robbery in American history. They had defeated the impenetrable fortress. And they had done it all without firing a single shot, without seriously injuring a single person. They had committed, it seemed, the perfect crime. The aftermath was a media sensation. The Great Brinks robbery was front-page news across the country and around the world. The audacity, the precision, the sheer scale of the heist captured the public's imagination. The thieves were not seen as violent thugs. They were seen as criminal geniuses, modern-day masterminds. The investigation that followed was one of the largest in the history of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover himself took a personal interest in the case. The pressure to solve the crime was immense. The FBI descended on Boston, interviewing hundreds of known criminals, informants, and underworld figures. They had very little to go on. The Brinks employees could provide only vague descriptions of the masked men. The thieves had left behind almost no physical evidence, just the rope and tape used to bind the employees, and a single chauffeur's cap that had been dropped at the scene. For weeks, the investigation went nowhere. The thieves had vanished as completely as the money they had stolen. The crew had made a pact. They would lay low, not spend any of the money conspicuously, and wait for the heat to die down. For a time, it seemed their plan had worked perfectly. They had committed the crime of the century, and they had gotten away with it. But the perfect crime is a myth. The flaw in any plan is always the human element. The bonds of trust and loyalty that held the 11 men together were about to be tested, and the pressure of sitting on a fortune they couldn't spend, combined with the relentless scrutiny of the FBI, would eventually cause the perfect plan to unravel from the inside out. The problem was not in the execution of the heist, but in what came after. The silence and discipline required to get away with it would prove to be a much harder job than the robbery itself. The clock was ticking, not on the police, but on the thieves themselves. And the biggest threat to their freedom was not the FBI, but their own greed, paranoia, and betrayal. The perfect crime was about to come undone. In the immediate aftermath of the heist, the 11 members of the Brinks crew followed their plan to the letter. They scattered, melted back into their quiet, working-class lives in Boston's tight-knit neighborhoods. And, most importantly, they stayed silent. The stolen money, a massive pile of cash weighing over a ton, was carefully divided and stashed away. The agreement was clear. No one was to touch their share. No one was to flash any sudden wealth, and no one was to talk. They were to wait for the statute of limitations on the robbery to expire, a period of 6 years, after which they could, in theory, never be prosecuted for the theft itself. For nearly 2 years, their discipline held. The FBI, despite having hundreds of agents working the case, was completely stumped. They had a long list of usual suspects from Boston's underworld, including the notorious Patriarcha crime family, but they could find no evidence, no chatter, no sign of the stolen money reappearing in the economy. The Brinks robbers had become ghosts, their perfect crime a source of deep and public embarrassment for J. Edgar Hoover and the entire Bureau. The case was a national obsession, but it was also a frustrating, impenetrable cold case. But the bonds of loyalty in the criminal underworld are rarely as strong as they seem. The pressure of the investigation, combined with the internal pressures of greed and paranoia, began to create cracks in the crew's silent facade. The first major problem was the money itself. The thieves had stolen a fortune, but it was a fortune they couldn't use. It sat in basements and hidden safes, a constant, taunting reminder of a wealth they couldn't enjoy. This created a deep sense of frustration. The bigger problem, however, was the human element. The crew was a diverse group of men, and not all of them had the same level of discipline or intelligence. The weak link, as it so often is, was a man who felt he hadn't gotten his fair share and was being disrespected by the others. His name was Joseph Specs O'Keefe. Specs O'Keefe was a tough, seasoned criminal, but he was also volatile and had a drinking problem. He felt that he had been instrumental in the planning and execution of the heist, but that he was being sidelined by the other members, particularly the leader, Tony Pino. He began to grow resentful and paranoid. He was also in constant legal trouble for other, unrelated crimes, and his legal fees were piling up. He needed money, and he needed it now. O'Keefe began to demand that the other members of the crew give him his cut of the loot before the agreed-upon time. They refused, sticking to the original plan. This refusal only fueled O'Keefe's rage and paranoia. He began to make veiled threats, hinting that he might be willing to talk to the authorities if he didn't get what he wanted. The other members of the crew saw him as a liability, a loose cannon who threatened to bring them all down. In a move to silence him, they hired a hitman to take him out. But the assassination attempt was a clumsy, botched affair. The hitman fired at O'Keefe, but only managed to wound him. Specs O'Keefe, now injured and convinced that his former partners were trying to kill him, realized he was out of options. He was facing a long prison sentence for other crimes. He was broke, and his own crew wanted him dead. He had only one card left to play. In January of 1956, just days before the 6-year statute of limitations was set to expire on the robbery, Specs O'Keefe made a decision. He walked into an FBI office and started to talk. His confession was the breakthrough the FBI had been waiting for 6 long years. He laid out the entire operation in meticulous detail. He named every single member of the 11-man crew. He described the 2 years of planning, the rehearsals, the copied keys, the uniforms, the masks. He gave the investigators the perfect crime on a silver platter. Based on O'Keefe's testimony, the FBI moved swiftly. They rounded up the remaining members of the crew. Tony Pino, Vinny Costa, Gus Gusciora, and the others were all arrested. The perfect crime had been undone, not by brilliant detective work, but by a simple, timeless motive, betrayal. The trial of the Brinks robbers, which began in August of 1956, was a media sensation. Specs O'Keefe was the star witness for the prosecution. He sat on the stand for days, calmly and coolly detailing every aspect of the crime he had helped to plan and execute. His former partners in crime could only sit and watch as he dismantled the secret world they had all built together. 8 members of the Brinks crew were convicted and given life sentences. 2 had already died of natural causes before the trial. 1, the locksmith who had unknowingly copied the keys, was acquitted. The crime of the century had finally been solved. But there was one final, enduring mystery. Of the nearly $3 million that was stolen, only about $58,000 was ever recovered. The vast majority of the cash, the great Brinks fortune, vanished as completely as the thieves themselves had for 6 years. Where did it go? Did the robbers manage to spend it, launder it, or hide it so well that it has never been found? Or did it, as some have speculated, get consumed by legal fees, bad investments, and the slow, steady drain of life on the run? The fate of the money is the final, unanswered question in the Brinks saga, a ghost of a fortune that has never been accounted for. The legacy of the great Brinks robbery is a profound one. It was, in many ways, the end of an era for American crime. It was one of the last great professional heists of the pre-digital age, a crime that relied on old-fashioned planning, skill, and discipline, rather than high-tech gadgetry or brute force. It was a story that, for a time, made criminals look like geniuses and the authorities look like fools. The case also had a significant impact on the security industry. The Brinks Company, and other institutions like it, completely overhauled their security protocols. They introduced more sophisticated alarms, time-locked vaults, and more rigorous employee screening. The days when a group of men could simply pick a few locks and walk out with a fortune were over. The story has been immortalized in books and films, most notably the 1978 movie The Brinks Job, starring Peter Falk. It has become a classic crime caper, a story that is admired for its sheer audacity and its brilliant, clockwork planning. The men who pulled it off have become figures of legend in the annals of American crime. They were not bloodthirsty gangsters, but working-class guys from the neighborhood who saw an opportunity and had the skill and the nerve to take it. They were, for a brief, shining moment, the kings of the underworld. But their story is also a cautionary tale. It is a story about the corrosive power of greed and the inherent instability of any criminal enterprise. The perfect plan was ultimately defeated by the imperfections of the men who created it. The same codes of loyalty and silence that allowed them to succeed were the very things that broke down and led to their downfall. Specs O'Keefe, the man who brought the whole thing down, was given a reduced sentence for his cooperation. He was eventually released from prison and lived out the rest of his life in quiet obscurity, forever known as the man who talked. The other convicted members of the crew served long sentences, many of them dying in prison. Tony Pino, the mastermind, was paroled in the 1970s and died a few years later, a man who had planned the crime of the century but had lived to see it all turn to dust. In the end, the Great Brinks robbery is a story that is as much about human nature as it is about crime. It is a story about ambition, loyalty, greed, and betrayal. It is a testament to the fact that you can plan for every contingency, you can account for every lock and every alarm, but you can never fully account for the unpredictable, volatile, and ultimately self-destructive nature of the human heart. The thieves got the money, but they couldn't buy silence. And in the world they lived in, silence was the only thing that was truly priceless. The crime was perfect, but the men were not. And that was a flaw in the plan from which there was no escape. You are absolutely correct to point that out, and I apologize for the significant discrepancy in the word count. That was a failure on my part to adhere to the requested parameters. I will ensure this next part meets the 3,000-word target. Thank you for your direct feedback. It's essential for me to get this right. The abduction of Frank Sinatra Jr., the crimes we have explored have been born of deep-seated malice, of cold-blooded professionalism, or of profound, tragic mystery. They are stories of darkness, of perpetrators who were either monstrously evil or chillingly competent. But there is another kind of crime, one that is not born of genius or rage, but of desperation, delusion, and a staggering degree of amateur incompetence. It's a crime that aimed for the highest echelons of American celebrity, a plot so audacious it seemed like something out of a pulp novel. but was executed with all the grace and precision of a falling anvil. For our next story, we travel to the glittering, high-stakes world of Lake Tahoe in the early 1960s. This is the era of the Rat Pack, of swinging casinos, and of a brand of celebrity that was almost mythic in its power. It is here that the son of the most famous entertainer on the planet would be kidnapped from his own dressing room, not by seasoned mobsters or criminal masterminds, but by a trio of down-on-their-luck former high school classmates who thought they had a foolproof plan to get rich quick. This is not a story of a perfect crime, but of a perfect storm of failure, a bizarre and almost comical kidnapping that turned into a national sensation and a terrifying ordeal. This is the story of the abduction of Frank Sinatra Jr. Our story begins in December of 1963. The nation was still reeling from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy just a few weeks earlier, a tragedy that had cast a long, dark shadow over the country. In the world of entertainment, however, the show had to go on. And in the neon-lit world of Lake Tahoe, the biggest name in entertainment was Sinatra. Frank Sinatra Sr., the chairman of the board, was at the absolute peak of his power. He was a global icon, a singer, an actor, a political power broker with connections that ran from the White House to the deepest corners of the criminal underworld. He was, in every sense, untouchable. His son, Frank Sinatra Jr., was trying to follow in his father's colossal footsteps. At 19, Frank Jr. was a fledgling singer with a good voice and the impossible burden of his last name. He was in the middle of a run of shows at Harrah's Club Lodge in State Line, Nevada, a premier casino on the south shore of Lake Tahoe. He was trying to build his own career, to step out of his father's enormous shadow. On the evening of Sunday, December 8, 1963, Frank Jr. was in his dressing room at Harrah's, relaxing between sets. A friend and trumpet player from his band was with him. The weather outside was terrible. A fierce blizzard was raging, burying the Sierra Nevada mountains in a deep blanket of snow. At around 9 p.m., there was a knock on the door. A man, claiming to be delivering a package, entered the room. A moment later, a second man followed, brandishing a pistol. This was not a delivery. It was a kidnapping. The two men were Barry Keenan and Joe Amsler. Keenan, 23, was the mastermind of the plot. He was a former high school classmate of Frank Jr.'s. Though they had not been close friends, Keenan was a troubled and ambitious young man. He had been a successful, if reckless, stockbroker in Los Angeles. But a series of bad decisions and a car accident had left him broke, addicted to painkillers, and deeply in debt. He was desperate for a big score that would solve all his problems. And in his mind, he had cooked up what he believed was the perfect plan. Kidnap the son of the world's most famous and wealthiest entertainer. His accomplices were Joe Amsler, 23, another former classmate, and John Irwin, 42, a house painter and a friend of Keenan's brother. They were not hardened criminals. They were amateurs, three guys from the San Fernando Valley who were in way over their heads. Keenan's plan, as he saw it, was brilliant in its simplicity. He believed that kidnapping Frank Sinatra Jr. would be a kind of karmic event. He saw the Sinatra family as a symbol of a corrupt and unfair system, and he convinced himself that this was not just a crime, but a kind of statement. He also believed it would be easy. He reasoned that Frank Sr., with his rumored connections to the mob, would be hesitant to involve the police and would simply pay the ransom quickly and quietly to avoid any bad publicity. It was a staggering miscalculation. Back in the dressing room, Keenan and Amsler tied up the trumpet player with tape and blindfolded him. They then told Frank Jr. that they were taking him. They blindfolded him as well, led him out of the hotel through a side door, and forced him into their waiting car. They drove off into the raging blizzard, heading for a prearranged safe house in Canoga Park, a suburb of Los Angeles. The kidnapping itself was a mess of amateur errors. The blizzard that was supposed to provide cover for their escape nearly became their undoing. They had to put chains on their tires to navigate the treacherous mountain roads. At one point, they were even stopped at a police roadblock. But the officers, focused on the weather conditions, simply checked their chains and waved them through, completely unaware that the most famous kidnap victim in the country was bound and blindfolded in the back seat. Back at Harrah's, the alarm was raised almost immediately. The trumpet player managed to free himself and alerted hotel security. The news of the kidnapping spread like wildfire. The FBI was called in, and J. Edgar Hoover himself took a personal interest in the case, just as he had with the Brinks robbery. The most powerful law enforcement agency in the world was now on the hunt for 3 amateur kidnappers from the valley. Frank Sinatra Sr. was in the middle of a film shoot in California when he received the news. He was, by all accounts, devastated and enraged. He immediately flew to Reno, Nevada, to set up a command post in a hotel suite, surrounded by his own team of trusted advisors and associates. He also called his close friend and lawyer Mickey Rudin, and, in a move that would fuel speculation for decades, he reached out to his alleged connections in the criminal underworld, putting the word out that he wanted his son back, no matter the cost. The FBI, meanwhile, was trying to get a handle on the situation. They tapped the Sinatra family's phones, waiting for the kidnappers to make contact. The case became a national obsession. The idea that someone would have the audacity to kidnap the son of Frank Sinatra was almost unthinkable. The media descended on Lake Tahoe and Reno, turning the case into a full-blown circus. The kidnappers, for their part, were beginning to realize just how far out of their depth they were. Their perfect plan was unraveling. The drive from Tahoe to their safe house in Canoga Park, which should have taken a few hours, turned into a long and stressful ordeal due to the blizzard. Their captive, Frank Jr., was surprisingly calm and composed throughout the ordeal, a fact that both impressed and unnerved them. The third member of the crew, John Irwin, was supposed to be the one to make the ransom call, but he was falling apart. He was older, less stable, and the pressure of the situation was getting to him. He was becoming increasingly paranoid and frightened. Finally, after a day of silence, the kidnappers made their first contact. Barry Keenan called Frank Sr.'s lawyer, Mickey Rudin, but the call was another example of their incompetence. Keenan had not thought through the logistics of the ransom drop. He didn't have a clear plan for how to exchange the money for the hostage. The initial calls were a series of confused and amateurish negotiations. Keenan eventually demanded a ransom of $240,000. The FBI provided the money, carefully marking the bills and recording the serial numbers. The plan for the drop was a convoluted one, involving a series of instructions to be delivered at different payphones between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Frank Sr. was ready to pay. He waited by the phone, his fortune and his formidable power rendered useless. A father desperate to get his son back. The FBI was monitoring everything, trying to trace the calls and get a location on the kidnappers. The entire country was watching, waiting to see how this high-stakes drama would play out. The kidnappers' plan for the ransom drop was as clumsy as the abduction itself. John Irwin, the designated bagman, was supposed to pick up the money, but he was becoming more erratic and unreliable by the hour. He was spooked by the massive police presence and the intense media scrutiny. The first attempt at a drop was a failure. Irwin was supposed to go to a specific gas station to receive the money, but he got lost and never showed up. Keenan, now handling the negotiations himself, had to come up with a new plan on the fly. He instructed Frank Sr. to have the money dropped off between 2 parked school buses at a gas station in Sepulveda, a suburb in the San Fernando Valley. On the night of December 11th, an FBI agent, posing as a Sinatra family employee, left the briefcase full of cash at the designated spot. The FBI had the area staked out, but in the darkness and confusion, they lost track of the man who picked up the money. John Irwin had managed to grab the cash and slip away. The kidnappers now had their money. The next step was to release Frank Jr., but by this point, the entire operation was on the verge of complete collapse. The 3 men were arguing, panicking, and making a series of foolish mistakes. The most critical mistake was made by John Irwin. After picking up the ransom, instead of laying low, he drove back to his home and immediately started talking. He told his brother what he had done. His brother, horrified, convinced him to turn himself in. Just hours after the ransom was paid, John Irwin, the weak link in the chain, was in police custody, and he was telling them everything. Meanwhile, Barry Keenan and Joe Amsler were at their safe house with Frank Jr., completely unaware that their partner had confessed. Their plan had always been to release Frank Jr. after they got the money. Now, with the money in hand, they were getting nervous. They knew the FBI would be closing in. In the early morning hours of December 12th, Keenan and Amsler decided it was time to let their hostage go. They drove Frank Jr., still blindfolded, up into the winding roads of the Santa Monica Mountains. They stopped on the side of the Mulholland Drive, a famous scenic overlook. They took off his blindfold, gave him a few dollars for a taxi, and told him to wait 10 minutes before moving. Then they drove off, leaving him alone on the dark, deserted road. Frank Sinatra Jr. was free. He walked down the hill until he was picked up by a security guard. He was taken to his mother's home in Bel Air. The ordeal was over. With Irwin's confession and Frank Jr.'s release, the FBI moved quickly to round up the other two kidnappers. Joe Amsler was arrested without incident at his home, but the mastermind, Barry Keenan, was harder to find. He had taken his share of the ransom money and had gone on the run. The FBI launched a massive manhunt for him. He was, for a brief time, one of the most wanted men in America, but his time as a fugitive was short-lived. He was arrested just a few days later in his apartment, where most of the ransom money was recovered. The crime of the century had lasted less than a week. The perfect plan had been a complete and total fiasco, a comedy of errors that had, by sheer luck, not ended in a greater tragedy. The three amateur kidnappers were in custody, the hostage was safe, and the money was mostly recovered. But the story was not over. The trial of Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin would become a spectacle in its own right. A bizarre courtroom drama that would raise as many questions as it answered, and it would give rise to a strange and persistent conspiracy theory, a rumor that has dogged the Sinatra family for decades. The idea that the entire kidnapping was not what it seemed, that it was, in fact, a hoax, a publicity stunt orchestrated by Frank Sinatra Jr. himself, with the tacit approval of his famous father. The crime was over, but the mystery of why it happened was just beginning. The trial of Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin, which took place in early 1964, was as much of a circus as the kidnapping itself. The prosecution, armed with the confessions of the kidnappers and the testimony of Frank Sinatra Jr., had what seemed to be an open-and-shut case. They laid out the story of a desperate, greedy plot, a crime motivated by money and a bizarre sense of entitlement on the part of Barry Keenan. But the defense attorneys chose a truly audacious strategy. They did not deny that their clients had taken Frank Jr. instead. They argued that it wasn't a real kidnapping at all. They claimed that the entire event had been a massive, elaborate publicity stunt, a hoax cooked up and orchestrated by Frank Sinatra Jr. himself, with the full knowledge and cooperation of his famous father. According to the defense's narrative, Frank Jr. was a young singer struggling to emerge from his father's colossal shadow. His career was languishing, and he was desperate for the kind of media attention that would make him a star in his own right. The defense argued that he had willingly participated in the kidnapping as a way to generate headlines and sympathy, a way to become a household name overnight. They portrayed their clients not as malicious criminals, but as dupes, as patsies who had been used by a cynical young celebrity and then thrown to the wolves when the plan went public. This theory, as outlandish as it sounded, was a stroke of courtroom genius. It tapped into a vein of public skepticism about the Sinatra family. Frank Sr.'s rumored connections to the mob, his immense power, and his notoriously thin skin made the idea of a secret, manipulative scheme seem plausible to some. The defense attorneys cross-examined Frank Jr. relentlessly, trying to poke holes in his story and paint him as an unreliable narrator. They pointed to his calm demeanor during the kidnapping, suggesting it was the composure of an actor playing a role, not a terrified victim. Frank Sinatra Jr., on the stand, was forced to relive his ordeal in excruciating detail, all while being accused of having fabricated the entire thing. He maintained his composure, steadfastly denying any involvement in a hoax and describing the genuine terror he had felt while being held captive. Frank Sr. also attended the trial, a looming, powerful presence in the courtroom. He was furious at the defense's strategy, seeing it as a disgusting and baseless attack on his family. His presence only fueled the media frenzy. The trial became a referendum on the Sinatra family itself, their fame, their power, and their secrets. The jury, however, was not swayed by the defense's elaborate conspiracy theory. The evidence against the kidnappers was overwhelming. They had confessed. The ransom money had been found in their possession. Their own actions, their incompetence, their panic. It all pointed to a real crime, not a staged one. In the end, the jury found Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin guilty. They were all given long prison sentences. The verdict officially closed the legal chapter of the case. But it did not kill the conspiracy theory. The idea that the kidnapping was a hoax has persisted for over 50 years, a stubborn piece of American folklore. It has been kept alive by skeptics, by authors, and by the public's endless fascination with celebrity scandal. The fact that the kidnappers were so comically inept has always been a key piece of evidence for proponents of the hoax theory. How could a crime against the most powerful family in America have been so easy, unless the victim was in on it? The truth, however, is likely far simpler and far more human. The kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. was not a work of genius, either criminal or promotional. It was a story of desperation. Barry Keenan was a young man whose life was falling apart. A man who saw a single, insane long shot as his only way out. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was a deluded amateur who managed, through a combination of audacity and sheer, dumb luck, to pull off the first part of his plan. He and his friends were not sophisticated enough to be part of a complex Sinatra-led conspiracy. They were simply in over their heads. The aftermath of the kidnapping had a profound and lasting effect on everyone involved. Frank Sinatra Sr. was deeply shaken by the event. For all his power and his tough guy image, he had been rendered helpless, a father terrified for his son's life. The incident reportedly made him even more protective and paranoid, increasing the size of his security detail and deepening his distrust of the outside world. Frank Sinatra Jr.'s life was also forever changed. The kidnapping and the subsequent accusations that he had staged it cast a long shadow over his career. For the rest of his life, he would be forced to answer questions about the hoax theory, to defend himself against a rumor that refused to die. The event that had made him a household name had also become an inescapable part of his identity. He continued his career as a singer and conductor, a respected musician in his own right, but he never fully escaped the shadow of those few terrifying days in December of 1963. He passed away in 2016, a man who had lived a long and successful life in music, but who was still in the first line of many of his obituaries, identified as the victim of one of America's most famous kidnappings. And what of the kidnappers themselves? Their perfect crime led them not to a life of wealth, but to a long stretch in federal prison. John Irwin, the weak link who confessed first, served the least amount of time. Joe Amsler also served his time and was eventually released. The most interesting postscript belongs to the mastermind, Barry Keenan. After serving just 4.5 years of his life sentence, he was released from prison. He had been a model prisoner and was deemed to have been rehabilitated. He went on to become a successful real estate developer and investor. In interviews years later, he expressed deep remorse for his actions, acknowledging the terror he had inflicted on the Sinatra family. He described the kidnapping not as a brilliant plan, but as the product of a young, foolish, and drug-addled mind. He became living proof that sometimes the most audacious and life-altering decisions are made not out of genius, but out of a profound and simple desperation. The legacy of the Frank Sinatra Jr. kidnapping is a strange and multifaceted one. It is a story that exists at the intersection of true crime, celebrity culture, and conspiracy theory. It was a crime that was both terrifyingly real for its victims and almost comically inept in its execution. It serves as a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of even the most powerful people. Frank Sinatra, a man who could move mountains with a phone call, was reduced to a helpless father, waiting by the phone, willing to pay any price to get his son back. The crime pierced the veil of celebrity invincibility, showing that even the brightest stars are not immune to the chaos and violence of the world. It is also a fascinating study in the anatomy of a failed crime. The kidnapper's plan was audacious in its conception but was doomed by its execution. They failed to account for the weather. They failed to plan the ransom drop. And most importantly, they failed to account for the weakness of their own team. Their story is a testament to the old criminal adage that the more people who are involved in a crime, the more likely it is to fail. And finally, the case is a powerful example of how a conspiracy theory can take on a life of its own, often overshadowing the truth of the event itself. The hoax theory, despite being thoroughly debunked in court and by all credible evidence, persists because it is a more interesting, more cynical, and perhaps more entertaining story than the reality. The reality is a rather sad and pathetic tale of three desperate young men who made a terrible decision. The conspiracy theory is a grand, sweeping narrative about the dark, manipulative heart of celebrity culture. In the end, people often choose the story they want to believe. We are left with a crime that is less a mystery of who or how, and more a mystery of why. Why did Barry Keenan believe such a reckless plan could ever succeed? And why has the false narrative of a hoax proven to be so enduring? The answers lie somewhere in the complex psychology of desperation, fame, and the public's endless fascination with the secret lives of the stars. The kidnapping was over in a matter of days, but the story, with all its strange and contradictory layers, has become a permanent fixture in the landscape of American pop culture, a bizarre and unforgettable chapter in the life of a legendary family. The Lindbergh kidnapping. The crimes we have explored have taken us into the worlds of celebrity, organized crime, and unsolved mysteries. They are stories that shocked their communities and captured the public imagination. But there is another level of crime, one so profound in its tragedy and so staggering in its scope that it doesn't just shock a nation. It changes it. It is a crime that targets not just a person, but a national hero, and in doing so, attacks the very idea of safety and security itself. For our final story, we travel back to a cold, windy night in rural New Jersey in the spring of 1932. This is the era of the Great Depression, a time of widespread desperation, but also a time of heroes, of figures who seem to represent the very best of American courage and ingenuity. It is here, in the secluded home of the most famous man in the world, that a crime would be committed that would be dubbed by the press as the crime of the century. This is not a story of a simple kidnapping, but of a national trauma, a mystery that would involve a cast of bizarre characters, a flawed and frantic investigation, and a trial that would become one of the most famous and controversial in American history. This is the story of the abduction and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. Our story begins with a man who was, in 1932, arguably the most beloved and admired person on the planet, Charles A. Lindbergh. In 1927, Lucky Lindy had become an international icon after completing the first solo, non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in his single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He was a symbol of American courage, innovation, and quiet, humble heroism. He was the all-American boy next door who had conquered the sky. In 1929, he married Anne Morrow, the intelligent and talented daughter of a wealthy diplomat. Their marriage was seen as a fairy tale, a union of American royalty. In 1930, their first child was born, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The baby, nicknamed the Eaglet by the adoring press, was instantly one of the most famous children in the world. He was the heir to a living legend. The Lindberghs, who were intensely private people, sought to escape the constant glare of the media spotlight. They built a large, secluded home for themselves in a remote, wooded area near the small town of Hopewell, New Jersey. The house was still under construction, but the family had begun to spend their weekends there, seeking a quiet refuge from the world. On the evening of Tuesday, March 1st, 1932, the Lindberghs were at their Hopewell home. It was a cold and windy night. Charles Lindbergh Jr., now 20 months old, had been put to bed in his nursery on the second floor around 8 p.m. His nurse, a woman named Betty Gow, had tucked him in, making sure he was warm and secure in his crib. At around 9 p.m., Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was in his study on the ground floor, heard a strange cracking sound, like a wooden box breaking, from outside. He didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just the wind. He and Betty Gow continued their quiet evening. At 10 p.m., Betty Gow went up to the nursery to check on the baby. She walked into the room and was met with a scene of quiet, chilling horror. The crib was empty. The window above the crib, which had been closed but not locked, was now open, and a cold wind was blowing into the room. On the windowsill there was a simple white envelope, and on the floor below the window there were muddy footprints. She immediately ran downstairs, her voice choked with panic, and asked in Lindbergh, "Do you have the baby?" and said no. Betty then found Charles Sr. and asked him the same question. When he too said no, the terrible reality of the situation crashed down upon them. Their son was gone. Lindbergh grabbed a rifle and ran outside, searching the dark, windy grounds, but he found nothing. He called the local Hopewell police and then the New Jersey State Police. The investigation began almost immediately. The police found a series of clues at the scene that painted a picture of a carefully planned, yet crudely executed, abduction. Below the nursery window, they found two distinct impressions in the soft, muddy ground, evidence that a ladder had been placed there. A short distance away, hidden in the bushes, they found the ladder itself. It was a homemade, wooden ladder, crudely constructed in 3 telescoping sections. It was a clever design but poorly built. One of the rungs was split, which likely explained the cracking sound Lindbergh had heard earlier in the evening. The kidnapper had likely broken the ladder during his descent with the child. Inside the nursery on the windowsill was the ransom note. It was written in a messy, barely literate hand, with numerous spelling and grammatical errors. The note was chillingly direct. It stated, "Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in gut care." The note was signed with a strange, interlocking symbol. 2 blue circles, a red circle in the middle, and 3 holes punched through it. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby became an instant global sensation. The story of the abduction of the son of America's greatest hero was the biggest news story in the world. The Lindbergh home was besieged by reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. The investigation became a chaotic 3-ring circus. Charles Lindbergh, a man who valued his privacy above all else, was now at the center of a media firestorm. But he was also a man of action, and he took control of the investigation in a way that was unprecedented. He essentially became the co-director of the entire operation, using his fame and influence to dictate the terms of the search for his son. He made a controversial decision early on. He announced that he was willing to pay the ransom and that he would negotiate directly with the kidnappers, even offering them immunity if they returned his son unharmed. He also reached out to his connections in the criminal underworld, asking prominent mob figures like Al Capone to use their networks to help find the baby. This decision created a great deal of friction with the official police investigation, which was being led by the head of the New Jersey State Police, Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the famous Gulf War general. The police wanted to conduct a traditional criminal investigation, but Lindbergh was running a parallel, private one, believing that paying the ransom was the only way to get his son back safely. The case then took a series of bizarre and dramatic turns, as a cast of strange and often unreliable characters inserted themselves into the drama. The most prominent of these was a man named Dr. John F. Condon, a retired school principal from the Bronx. Condon, a well-meaning but eccentric and publicity-loving man, placed an ad in a local newspaper, offering to act as an intermediary between Lindbergh and the kidnappers. To everyone's surprise, the kidnappers responded. A series of convoluted negotiations began with Condon, who gave himself the code name Jafsy, acting as the go-between. He communicated with the kidnappers through a series of newspaper ads and letters. He even had a face-to-face meeting with a man who claimed to be one of the kidnappers, a man with a thick German accent who called himself John. The negotiations culminated in a dramatic ransom drop. On the night of April 2nd, 1932, just over a month after the kidnapping, Dr. Condon met John in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. He handed over a wooden box containing $50,000 in cash. The money was a mix of regular currency and gold certificates, the serial numbers of which had been meticulously recorded by the FBI. In exchange, John gave Condon a note, which supposedly revealed the location of the baby. The note claimed the child was safe on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Lindbergh, his hopes soaring, immediately chartered a plane and flew to the location described in the note. But his hopes were brutally dashed. There was no boat named Nellie. There was no sign of his son. The note was a cruel deception. The kidnappers had their money, but the baby was still missing. The search continued, but the mood had shifted from one of desperate hope to one of deep despair. The days turned into weeks. And then, on May 12, 1932, 72 days after he had been stolen from his crib, the story reached its tragic and horrifying conclusion. A truck driver, pulled over on the side of a road just a few miles from the Lindbergh home, walked into a small patch of woods to relieve himself. There, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, he found the decomposing body of a small child. Dental records confirmed the identity. It was Charles Lindbergh Jr. The autopsy revealed that the baby had died from a massive skull fracture. He had likely been killed on the very night of the kidnapping. His head either intentionally or accidentally struck during the chaotic abduction and the fall from the broken ladder. The crime of the century was no longer a kidnapping. It was a murder case. The nation was plunged into a state of collective grief and rage. The hunt for the kidnapper was now a hunt for a child killer. The investigation, which had been focused on a rescue, now became a massive, painstaking manhunt. The only real clue they had was the ransom money. The FBI had distributed a list of the serial numbers of the gold certificates to every bank in the country. They knew that sooner or later the killer would have to spend the money, and so they waited patiently for a piece of that hot money to surface. The wait would be a long one. For over 2 years, the case went cold. The trail of the man with the German accent and the strange signature had grown faint, but the FBI and the police never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. The Lindbergh case had become a national obsession, a wound that would not heal until the killer was brought to justice. The search for the man who had climbed that crude wooden ladder was far from over. It was about to zero in on a quiet German immigrant carpenter living in the Bronx, a man whose life was about to be turned upside down, and whose name would become forever synonymous with the crime of the century. The murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. transformed the case from a national drama into a national obsession. The manhunt that followed was one of the most extensive and painstaking in American history. The primary weapon in the investigators' arsenal was the list of serial numbers from the ransom money, particularly the gold certificates, which were soon to be recalled from circulation by the U.S. government, making them even more conspicuous. The police and the FBI settled in for a long, patient wait, knowing that the killer's greed would eventually be his undoing. For more than 2 years, the trail remained ice cold. The hot money surfaced only sporadically. A single bill here, a $10 certificate there, passed at a movie theater or a corner store, always in transactions too small and too anonymous to be traced back to a source. The investigation was a vast and frustrating puzzle, with thousands of leads that led nowhere. The public remained captivated, but hope of finding the killer began to fade. Then, on September 15, 1934, a gas station attendant in Manhattan received a $10 gold certificate as payment. Following protocol, he jotted down the license plate number of the car on the back of the bill. A few days later, when the bill was deposited at the bank, it was flagged. The serial number matched the Lindbergh ransom money. It was the breakthrough the investigation had been waiting for 2.5 years. The license plate was traced to a blue Dodge sedan belonging to a man named Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Hauptmann was a 35-year-old German immigrant carpenter who lived in the Bronx with his wife, Anna, and their young son. He was, by all appearances, an ordinary working-class man. He had a criminal record in Germany, including robbery and theft, and had entered the United States illegally by stowing away on a ship. He was a quiet man who kept to himself, a skilled woodworker who seemed to be living a modest life. On September 19, 1934, the police descended on Hauptmann's home. They arrested him, and a search of his property uncovered a mountain of damning evidence. In his garage, hidden in a wall, they found a stash of over $14,600 of the Lindbergh ransom money. It was the smoking gun, but there was more. The investigators conducted a meticulous analysis of the homemade ladder that had been found at the Lindbergh estate. The wood used to construct the ladder was a key piece of evidence. A wood expert, Arthur Kohler, was able to trace one of the wooden rails of the ladder, Rail 16, as it became famously known, to a specific shipment of lumber that had been sold to a Bronx lumberyard. He then examined the floorboards in Hauptmann's attic, which were missing a plank. The wood from Rail 16 was a perfect match to the grain, the species, and even the nail holes of the missing plank in Hauptmann's attic floor. It was a stunning piece of forensic science, a direct physical link between the suspect and the crime scene. The evidence continued to pile up. Hauptmann's handwriting was compared to the 15 ransom notes that had been sent to Lindbergh and Dr. Condon. A team of handwriting experts concluded that it was a definitive match. The strange spellings and grammatical quirks in the notes were consistent with Hauptmann's own German-influenced writing style. Furthermore, Dr. Condon, the Jaffe intermediary, identified Hauptmann in a police lineup as the John he had met with in the cemetery to deliver the ransom, and Hauptmann's phone number and address were found scrawled on the inside of a closet door in Dr. Condon's home, where he had jotted it down during a phone conversation with the kidnapper. The case against Bruno Richard Hauptmann seemed overwhelming, a fortress of circumstantial but incredibly powerful evidence. He was charged with extortion and murder and extradited to New Jersey to stand trial. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, which began in January of 1935 in the small town of Flemington, New Jersey, was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a global media event. It was dubbed the trial of the century. Hundreds of reporters from around the world descended on the small town, turning the courthouse into a chaotic circus. The public was hungry for justice, and Hauptmann, the quiet German carpenter, was cast as the monstrous villain in the nation's great tragedy. The prosecution, led by New Jersey Attorney General David T. Willans, laid out its case with methodical precision. They presented the ransom money found in Hauptmann's garage. They brought in the wood expert, Arthur Kohler, who delivered a brilliant and compelling testimony, demonstrating to the jury how the attic floorboard and the ladder rail were one and the same. They presented the handwriting experts who testified that Hauptmann had written the ransom notes. They put Dr. Condon on the stand, who pointed directly at Hauptmann and identified him as the man from the cemetery. And they put Charles Lindbergh himself on the stand. In a moment of high drama, Lindbergh testified that he had been parked in a car near the cemetery during the ransom drop and had heard the man John call out to Condon. He stated, with chilling certainty, that the voice he had heard belonged to Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The defense, led by a flamboyant and often erratic attorney named Edward J. Riley, argued that Hauptmann was an innocent man, a victim of a massive frame-up. They claimed that the real kidnapper was a man named Isidor Fish, a business partner of Hauptmann's who had since died in Germany. Hauptmann testified in his own defense, claiming that Fish had given him the box of money for safekeeping before he left for Germany, and that he had no idea it was the Lindbergh ransom money. He claimed he had only started spending it after he learned of Fish's death. His story was weak and full of inconsistencies. He could not provide a credible alibi for his whereabouts on the night of the kidnapping. He struggled to explain why he had hidden the money in his garage or why a key piece of the ladder had been made from a plank in his attic. He spoke in a thick German accent, and his demeanor on the stand came across as arrogant and evasive. The defense also tried to discredit the prosecution's evidence. They argued that the handwriting analysis was junk science. They claimed that Dr. Condon's identification was unreliable, and they suggested that the police had planted the evidence, that they had been so desperate to solve the case that they had framed an innocent German immigrant. But the weight of the evidence against Hauptmann was too great. After a 5-week trial that had captivated the world, the jury deliberated for 11 hours. On February 13, 1935, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory: death by electrocution. The conviction of Bruno Richard Hauptmann was met with a wave of public approval. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The monster who had killed America's eaglet had been caught and was going to pay the ultimate price. But the story was not over. In the years between his conviction and his execution, the case became a source of intense debate and controversy. Despite the seemingly overwhelming evidence, a significant number of people, then and now, have come to believe that Hauptmann was not guilty, or at least that he was not the only one involved. The arguments for his innocence, or at least for a miscarriage of justice, are compelling. The trial itself was a media circus, a mob justice atmosphere where a fair trial was almost impossible. The evidence, while strong, was entirely circumstantial. There were no fingerprints belonging to Hauptmann found at the Lindbergh home, and Hauptmann himself, right up until the very end, steadfastly proclaimed his innocence. He was offered a deal to have his sentence commuted to life in prison if he would confess and name his accomplices. He refused, reportedly telling his wife, "I will die with a clean conscience." The theory that he was part of a larger conspiracy, that he was not the mastermind but merely a pawn, has been a persistent one. It seems almost impossible that a lone carpenter, working with a crude, homemade ladder, could have pulled off such a complex and audacious crime against the most famous man in the world. Was he working with others? Was he simply the bagman, the one who was left holding the money when the plan went wrong? There were other, strange threads in the investigation that were never fully pursued. A number of Lindbergh's own household staff came under suspicion. There was Violet Sharp, a maid in the home of and Lindbergh's mother, who committed suicide by drinking poison after being questioned by the police. Was she hiding a secret? Did she have knowledge of the crime? And what of the powerful and shadowy figures of the underworld that Lindbergh himself had tried to involve in the search? Could the kidnapping have been a mob-related crime that went horribly wrong? These questions have fueled a cottage industry of books, documentaries, and amateur investigations for nearly a century. The Lindbergh case is not just a crime. It is a text, one that can be read and reread, with new interpretations and new theories emerging with each generation. But for the state of New Jersey and the American justice system, the case was closed. Bruno Richard Hauptmann exhausted all of his appeals. On April 3, 1936, he was executed in the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison. He went to his death still proclaiming his innocence. The legacy of the Lindbergh kidnapping is a profound and multi-layered one. It was a crime that fundamentally changed the relationship between the media and the justice system, creating the template for the modern trial of the century media frenzy. It also led to significant legal changes. The Lindbergh Law was passed, making kidnapping a federal crime, giving the FBI jurisdiction in such cases. But its deepest legacy is a cultural one. The crime was a national trauma, a loss of innocence from which the country never fully recovered. It was a story that had everything: a national hero, a beautiful family, a tragic victim, and a monstrous villain. It was a real-life fairy tale that had turned into a horror story. The case also serves as a powerful and unsettling study in the nature of evidence and belief. Was the case against Hauptmann a brilliant piece of forensic detective work that brought a guilty man to justice? Or was it a tragic miscarriage of justice, a case where a desperate police force and a vengeful public opinion conspired to frame an innocent man for a crime he did not commit? The truth is, we will likely never know for certain. The evidence is compelling, but the doubts linger. The story is too clean, and yet too messy to be easily resolved. Bruno Richard Hauptmann is either one of the most cold-blooded and audacious child killers in American history, or he is one of its most tragic victims of a wrongful conviction. There is very little room for a middle ground. We are left with the image of that crude, homemade ladder, leaning against the side of a house on a dark and windy night. It is a symbol of a crime that was both amateurish and devastatingly effective. It is a symbol of a breach, a violation of the safest of spaces. And it is a symbol of a mystery that, despite a conviction and an execution, has never felt truly and completely solved. The baby was found, the killer was executed, but the questions, like ghosts, still linger in the quiet woods of Hopewell, New Jersey. The crime of the century is over, but its power to fascinate, to horrify, and to divide remains as potent as ever. The hijacking of TWA Flight 847, the crimes we have explored have taken us through the annals of history. From the dark alleys of the Depression to the sun-drenched beaches of Australia, They are stories that often feel like relics of a bygone era. But there is another kind of crime, one that is terrifyingly modern, a form of violence that became a defining feature of the late 20th century and shaped the world we live in today. It is the crime of international terrorism, played out not in a single location, but across a global stage. For our next story, we travel to the turbulent skies of the Mediterranean and the chaotic streets of the Middle East in the mid-1980s. This is an era of intense geopolitical conflict, a time when commercial airliners became floating battlegrounds and ordinary citizens became pawns in a complex and violent political chess game. This is not a story of a single, clean act, but of a long, grueling, and terrifying ordeal. A 17-day hijacking that would bounce between cities, involve multiple governments, and hold the world captive. This is the story of TWA Flight 847. Our story begins on the morning of Friday, June 14, 1985. TWA Flight 847, a Boeing 727, was on a routine flight from Athens, Greece to Rome, Italy. It was the first leg of a multi-stop journey that had originated in Cairo and was scheduled to end in San Diego. On board were 145 passengers and a crew of 8. The passengers were a mix of tourists and business travelers, many of them Americans, excited to be exploring the historic cities of Europe. Shortly after takeoff from Athens, as the plane climbed over the blue Aegean Sea, the calm was shattered. 2 men who had been sitting among the passengers stood up. They were armed with a 9mm pistol and 2 grenades. They ran down the aisle, screaming in Arabic and broken English, and stormed the cockpit. They were members of Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese Shia Islamist militant group, though their direct affiliation was initially unclear. The hijacking of TWA Flight 847 had begun. The hijackers immediately took control of the aircraft. They were young, intense, and highly agitated. They began to systematically round up any passengers who had Israeli-sounding names or who they suspected of being Israeli. They also began to identify and separate the American passengers, particularly those with military identification. One of the flight attendants, a courageous and quick-thinking woman named Uli Derrickson, became the de facto negotiator and protector of the passengers. She was German-born and spoke fluent German, which allowed her to communicate with one of the hijackers who spoke the language. For the next 55 hours, she would act as a vital buffer between the terrified hostages and their volatile captors, a performance of incredible bravery that would save many lives. The hijackers ordered the pilot, Captain John Testrake, to change course. Their initial demand was to fly to Algiers, Algeria. The plane was low on fuel and the flight to Algiers was a long one. As they flew across the Mediterranean, the first phase of a long and terrifying ordeal began. The hijackers were trying to secure the release of over 700 Shia Muslims who were being held in Israeli prisons. They saw the American and Israeli passengers on the plane as valuable bargaining chips. The plane landed in Beirut, Lebanon, to refuel. It was here, on the tarmac of the chaotic Beirut International Airport, that a third hijacker and accomplice was allowed to board the plane, bringing with him more weapons and explosives. It was also here that the hijackers began to release some of the hostages, mostly women and children, in exchange for fuel. But for the men, particularly the Americans and Israelis, the terror was just beginning. After refueling in Beirut, the plane took off again and flew to Algiers. The negotiations continued, a complex and frustrating dance between the hijackers, the airline, and various governments. But the hijackers were growing impatient. They wanted their demands met, and they were willing to use violence to prove their seriousness. From Algiers, the plane took off once more and flew back to Beirut. It was during this second stop in the war-torn Lebanese capital that the hijacking took its most brutal and tragic turn. The hijackers had identified a U.S. Navy Seabee, a 23-year-old steelworker named Robert Stetham, who was returning from an assignment in the Middle East. They saw him, a young American military man, as a symbol of their enemy. They took Robert Stetham from his seat. They beat him viciously for hours. Then they took him to the open door of the aircraft. They shot him in the head at point-blank range and unceremoniously dumped his body onto the tarmac below. It was a cold-blooded, calculated act of murder, designed to send a message to the world and to escalate the crisis to a new level of terror. The hijackers had proven they were not just making threats. They were willing to kill. The murder of Robert Stetham was broadcast around the world. The image of his body lying on the tarmac became a powerful and horrifying symbol of the hijacking. The pressure on the U.S. government under President Ronald Reagan was now immense. The American public was outraged and demanded action. The hijackers, meanwhile, continued their macabre journey. They forced the plane to take off from Beirut once again and fly back to Algiers. The plane was now a flying prison, a place of unimaginable fear and uncertainty for the remaining hostages. They were shuttled back and forth between Beirut and Algiers, a terrifying and exhausting hell ride, as one of the survivors later called it. In Algiers, another group of hostages was released, a small act of mercy in the midst of the ongoing terror. But for the approximately 40 remaining hostages, mostly American men, the ordeal was far from over. The plane then made its third and final flight, returning once again to Beirut. By this point, the hijacking had been going on for days. The hijackers had separated the remaining American and Israeli men from the other passengers. They were taken off the plane and spirited away into the chaotic, war-torn suburbs of southern Beirut, a stronghold of Hezbollah. They were now no longer just hostages on a plane. They were prisoners of a powerful and shadowy militant organization, hidden away in the basements and back rooms of a city at war. The hijacking of the plane itself was over, but the hostage crisis had entered a new and even more complex and dangerous phase. The world's media descended on Beirut, and the crisis became a daily, televised drama. The faces of the hostages were shown on television. Their families in the United States held vigils and made desperate public appeals. The crisis had become a global spectacle. The negotiations were now incredibly complicated. The U.S. government was dealing not with a small group of hijackers on a plane, but with the shadowy leadership of Hezbollah, through a series of intermediaries, including Nabi Berri, the leader of the Amal movement, another powerful Lebanese Shia militia. The official U.S. government policy was clear. They would not negotiate with terrorists. But behind the scenes, a frantic and complex series of back-channel negotiations was underway. The Reagan administration was caught in a terrible bind. They wanted to secure the release of the hostages, but they did not want to be seen as giving in to terrorist demands. And they certainly did not want to pressure their key ally, Israel, to release hundreds of prisoners, which they saw as a reward for terrorism. For 2 long weeks, the remaining hostages were held in captivity in Beirut. They were moved from location to location to avoid any potential rescue attempts. They were held in squalid, terrifying conditions, constantly under the guard of heavily armed militants. They were interrogated, threatened, and lived every moment with the fear that they could be the next Robert Stetham. The crisis became a test of wills, a high-stakes geopolitical chess game with human lives as the pawns. The Reagan administration considered a military rescue option, but the challenges were immense. A raid into the heart of Hezbollah-controlled Beirut would be incredibly risky and would likely result in a bloodbath, killing both the hostages and a large number of civilians. The memory of the failed Iran hostage rescue mission a few years earlier was still fresh in the minds of American military planners. As the days turned into weeks, the diplomatic efforts intensified. The United States, while publicly refusing to negotiate, was privately working through intermediaries to find a solution. The key was Israel. The hijackers' primary demand was the release of the Shia prisoners held in Israeli jails. The U.S. began to put quiet, behind-the-scenes pressure on Israel to release the prisoners, not as a direct concession to the hijackers, but as a separate, unrelated humanitarian gesture. It was a delicate and politically fraught dance. Israel was reluctant to release prisoners they considered to be a security threat, but they were also under pressure to help resolve a crisis that involved an American ally. Finally, after 17 days of terror, a breakthrough was reached. Israel agreed to begin a phased release of the Shia prisoners. It was not officially a quid pro quo, but the timing was unmistakable. On June 30th, 1985, the 39 remaining American hostages were driven in a convoy to the Syrian border and handed over to international authorities. They were flown to a U.S. military base in West Germany and then finally back home to the United States. The long ordeal of TWA Flight 847 was over. The hostages were free, but the story was not. The resolution of the crisis left a legacy of controversy and unanswered questions. The Reagan administration had officially maintained its policy of not negotiating with terrorists, but in reality, a deal had been struck. The hijackers had, in a sense, achieved their primary goal. The hunt for the men responsible for the hijacking and the murder of Robert Stetham was just beginning. It would be a long, slow, and often frustrating quest for justice, a pursuit that would span decades and continents. As U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies worked to track down the shadowy figures who had perpetrated one of the most infamous hijackings of the modern era. The passengers were home, but the ghosts of Flight 847 would continue to haunt the world of international politics and counterterrorism for years to come. The return of the 39 hostages to American soil was met with a wave of national relief and celebration. They were hailed as heroes who had endured an unimaginable ordeal with courage and dignity. But behind the yellow ribbons and the welcome home ceremonies, a more complicated reality was setting in. The resolution of the crisis was, for many, a bitter pill to swallow. The United States had, in effect, negotiated with terrorists and had pressured an ally to make concessions. The hijackers had not been captured or killed. They had been allowed to melt back into the shadows of Beirut, and they had, in large part, succeeded in their mission. This outcome created a deep and lasting sense of anger, particularly within the U.S. intelligence and military communities, and most profoundly, within the family of Robert Stetham. The man who had murdered their son was still at large, and the organization that had sponsored the hijacking had been, in a sense, rewarded for their actions. The quest for justice for Robert Stetham became a driving force for the U.S. government, a long and patient hunt that would become a landmark case in the history of international counterterrorism law. The investigation to identify and locate the perpetrators was a massive and complex undertaking. The FBI, working with intelligence agencies around the world, began the painstaking process of piecing together the identities of the hijackers. They had the testimony of the hostages, who provided detailed descriptions. They had intelligence chatter from the Middle East, and they had the name of the man who had been the public face of the hijacking, Omar Razak. But finding these men in the chaotic, factionalized world of 1980s Lebanon was a nearly impossible task. They were protected by Hezbollah and other militant groups, operating in a city where Western intelligence had little to no presence on the ground. For years, the case remained a frustrating and seemingly unsolvable puzzle. The first major breakthrough came in 1987, 2 years after the hijacking. One of the key hijackers, a man named Muhammad Ali Hamadi, was arrested in Frankfurt, West Germany, while attempting to smuggle liquid explosives. The United States immediately requested his extradition to stand trial for his role in the TWA 847 hijacking and the murder of Robert Stetham. But the case became entangled in a web of international politics. At the same time that Hamadi was being held in Germany, 2 German citizens were being held hostage by Hezbollah in Lebanon. The German government was faced with a terrible choice. If they extradited Hamadi to the United States, it was almost certain that the German hostages in Lebanon would be killed in retaliation. In a decision that was heavily criticized by the Reagan administration, Germany refused to extradite Hamadi. Instead, they put him on trial in Germany for his crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the story took another bizarre turn. In 2005, after serving 19 years of his sentence, Muhammad Ali Hamadi was granted parole and released from prison. He immediately returned to Lebanon, a free man. The U.S. government was outraged, and he remains on the FBI's most wanted terrorists list to this day, with a multi-million-dollar reward for his capture. The hunt for the other hijackers continued. Omar Razak, the man who had shot Robert Stetham and led the initial phase of the hijacking, had also disappeared. But the FBI never stopped looking for him. In 1993, 8 years after the hijacking, they got a lucky break. They received intelligence that Razak was traveling from Lebanon to Nigeria. In a daring and covert international operation, U.S. agents, working with Nigerian authorities, intercepted him. He was essentially kidnapped, put on a plane, and flown to the United States, where he was arrested the moment he landed on American soil. His trial in Washington, D.C. was a landmark event. It was one of the first times a foreign terrorist had been brought to the United States to stand trial for crimes committed against American citizens overseas. Razak was convicted of air piracy and sentenced to life in prison, where he remains today. Justice, at least for one of the key perpetrators, had finally been served. The legacy of the TWA Flight 847 hijacking is a profound and multi-layered one. It was a turning point in the history of modern terrorism. The 17-day ordeal, broadcast live on television screens around the world, was a masterclass in media manipulation. The hijackers understood the power of the 24-hour news cycle and used it to their full advantage, turning their crime into a global political drama. The event helped to create the template for a new kind of terrorism, one that was not just about violence but about spectacle. The hijacking also had a significant impact on airline security. It highlighted the vulnerability of international airports, particularly in less stable regions, and led to a wave of new security measures, including more rigorous passport checks, enhanced screening of passengers, and the reinforcement of cockpit doors. The era of casual, easily accessible air travel was coming to a swift and decisive end. But the most significant legacy of the case is a legal and political one. The controversial resolution of the crisis, in which the hostages were freed in exchange for the release of prisoners, fueled a fierce debate within the U.S. government about the no negotiations policy. It highlighted the immense difficulty of adhering to a hardline policy when the lives of innocent citizens are on the line. This dilemma would come to a head just a few months later, in what would become known as the Iran-Contra affair. It was revealed that members of the Reagan administration, in a secret and illegal operation, had sold weapons to Iran in exchange for their help in securing the release of other American hostages being held in Lebanon. The TWA 847 crisis, and the pressure it created to do something to free American hostages, is seen by many historians as a direct precursor to the disastrous decisions made in the Iran-Contra scandal. For the survivors of Flight 847, the ordeal left a lifetime of trauma. They had lived through an experience that few people could even imagine. They had witnessed murder, endured constant fear, and had been used as pawns in a global political game. Many of them struggled for years with post-traumatic stress disorder, but they also showed incredible resilience. Many of the survivors, including Captain John Testrake and flight attendant Uli Derrickson, went on to write books and give interviews about their experience, ensuring that the human story of the hijacking was not lost in the political and historical analysis. The story of Robert Stetham, the young Navy Seabee who was murdered on the tarmac, also left a lasting legacy. He became a symbol of American courage and sacrifice in the face of terrorism. A U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Stetham, was named in his honor, a permanent tribute to the young man who lost his life on that terrible day. In the end, the story of TWA Flight 847 is a complex and sobering tale. It is a story with no easy heroes or villains, outside of the hijackers themselves. It is a story of difficult choices, of compromised principles, and of the messy, often tragic reality of international politics. It was a crime that was not solved in a single dramatic raid, but through decades of patient, frustrating, and often controversial diplomatic and legal maneuvering. The hijacking was a brutal lesson in the nature of modern terrorism. It showed the world that a small group of determined individuals could hold a superpower hostage, that the media could be used as a weapon, and that there are no easy answers in the fight against an enemy who does not play by any rules. The passengers of TWA Flight 847 eventually came home, but the world they returned to had been changed by their ordeal. The hijacking was a harbinger of the kind of globalized, media-driven terror that would come to define the decades that followed, a long and bloody chapter in modern history that began, for many Americans, on the tarmac of a lonely airport in Beirut. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, the crimes we have explored have been chronicles of human darkness, mysteries of violence, terror, and loss. But there is another kind of crime, one that is not defined by the taking of a life, but by the taking of something irreplaceable, something that holds the memory and the soul of a culture. It's a crime against history itself, a theft so audacious, so brilliant, and so profoundly strange that it has become the single largest and most baffling art heist in modern history. For our final story, we travel to the elegant, gaslit streets of Boston's Fenway neighborhood, back to the early morning hours of St. Patrick's Day, 1990. This is not a story of a bloody crime scene, but of an empty one. It's a tale of empty frames hanging on a wall, of priceless masterpieces that vanished into the night, and of a mystery that has haunted the art world and the FBI for over 30 years. This is not a search for a killer, but for ghosts of a different kind, the lost treasures of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Our story begins at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a place that is as much a work of art as the collection it houses. The museum was the life's work of Isabella Stewart Gardner, a wealthy, eccentric, and brilliant art collector who, at the turn of the 20th century, built a magnificent Venetian-style palace in the heart of Boston to house her world-class collection. The museum is a unique and intimate space, designed not as a sterile gallery, but as a home, with paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and furniture arranged just as Mrs. Gardner had left them. Her will stipulated that the collection must remain exactly as she had arranged it. If anything were to be moved, the entire collection was to be sold off. This clause turned the museum into a perfectly preserved time capsule, a place where art and life were permanently intertwined. On the night of March 17, 1990, Boston was in the full swing of its annual St. Patrick's Day celebrations. The streets were full of revelers, and the city was alive with a festive, chaotic energy. Inside the Gardner Museum, the party was over. The last of the visitors had gone home, and the building had settled into its nighttime quiet. On duty that night were two young security guards, Rick Abath, 23, and his partner, whose name has been withheld but we will call Randy, 25. They were the only two people responsible for protecting a collection worth billions of dollars. Abath was a musician in a rock band, a self-described hippie who often showed up for his shift smelling of marijuana. Randy was an art student. Neither of them had any formal security training. They were, in essence, night watchmen in one of the most important art museums in the world. At 1:24 a.m. on the morning of March 18th, a buzzer rang at the security desk. Two men, dressed in what appeared to be police uniforms, were at the side entrance. They spoke to Rick Abath through the intercom, telling him that they were responding to a report of a disturbance in the museum's courtyard. This was a breach of protocol. The guards were supposed to call the police to verify any such report before opening the door. But Abath, perhaps seeing the uniforms and believing them to be legitimate, or perhaps simply making a foolish mistake, buzzed them in. The two men entered the museum. They were not police officers. They were thieves. They immediately approached the security desk and told Abath that he looked familiar and that there was a warrant out for his arrest. They ordered him to step away from the desk and face the wall. Abath, intimidated and confused, complied. In doing so, he stepped away from the only alarm button in the room, the one that would have silently alerted the real police. The thieves quickly and professionally handcuffed him. When the second guard, Randy, came to investigate the commotion, he too was handcuffed. The two guards were then taken down to the museum's basement, their hands and feet bound with duct tape, and they were left in separate, dark corners, far from any alarms. They were told not to make a sound and that if they behaved, they wouldn't be harmed. The thieves now had the entire museum to themselves. They were completely and totally alone with one of the greatest art collections in the world. What followed was not a smash-and-grab robbery. It was a strange, deliberate, and almost leisurely art shopping spree that would last for 81 minutes. The thieves seemed to know exactly what they wanted, but their choices were baffling. They moved through the museum's galleries with a confident familiarity. They went directly to the Dutch Room, home to some of the museum's most priceless treasures. Here, they committed their most devastating acts. They took Johannes Vermeer's masterpiece, The Concert, one of only 34 known Vermeers in the world, a painting so rare it is considered virtually priceless. They also took two Rembrandts. The first was A Lady and Gentleman in Black, a stunning double portrait. The second was Rembrandt's only known seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. In a shocking act of brute force, they did not carefully remove these paintings from their frames. They sliced them out with a knife, the sound of the canvas tearing echoing through the silent gallery. The empty, Gilded frames were left behind on the floor. They also took a small Rembrandt self-portrait etching, about the size of a postage stamp, from the side of a display case. But they left behind another, far more valuable Rembrandt portrait that was hanging nearby. Their choices continued to be perplexing. They took a painting by Govert Flinck, a student of Rembrandt, but they first tried to remove a different, more valuable painting by Edouard Manet from the Blue Room. After struggling to unscrew the frame from the wall, they seemed to give up and moved on. They also stole a series of 5 Degas drawings of racehorses, and, in one of the most bizarre and inexplicable parts of the heist, they took a finial from the top of a Napoleonic flag, a small bronze eagle. They left the valuable silk flag itself behind. They also stole an ancient Chinese bronze beaker, or gu. The thieves roamed the museum for nearly an hour and a half, selecting and removing these specific pieces. They completely ignored other, far more valuable works of art, including a Titian masterpiece, The Rape of Europa, which was one of Mrs. Gardner's most prized possessions and was hanging in plain sight. Their haul was a strange and eclectic mix of priceless masterpieces and relatively minor works. The total value of the stolen art was estimated at over $200 million in 1990, making it the largest property theft in history. Today, its value is estimated to be well over $500 million, though in reality, the works are so famous they are considered unsellable and therefore priceless. At around 2:45 a.m., the thieves made their final stop. They returned to the basement where the 2 guards were being held. They checked on them, asked if they were comfortable, and then moved them to a different location in the basement. Then they vanished. The 2 guards remained bound in the basement for hours. It wasn't until the morning shift arrived at 8:15 a.m. and found the museum eerily quiet that the alarm was finally raised. The police were called, and the world slowly began to learn of the audacious crime that had taken place. The investigation began immediately, a joint effort between the Boston Police Department and the FBI. The crime scene was a frustrating mix of clues and contradictions. The thieves had been captured on the museum's motion detectors, which tracked their movements through the galleries, giving the police a detailed timeline of their 81 minutes inside. But the museum had no video surveillance cameras, a shocking security lapse for an institution of its importance. The police had detailed descriptions of the 2 men from the security guards. They were white males, one in his 30s with a mustache, the other in his 20s. But the descriptions were generic, and the police uniforms they wore were likely a disguise. The primary evidence the thieves left behind was the duct tape and handcuffs used to bind the guards. For years, forensic analysis of this evidence yielded nothing. The thieves had been careful. They wore gloves. They left no fingerprints, no hairs, no fibers. They had moved through the museum like ghosts, taking what they wanted and then disappearing back into the city. The investigation quickly centered on trying to understand the thieves' baffling choices. Why take a small Rembrandt etching and leave a massive Titian? Why steal a Napoleonic eagle finial and leave the flag? The eclectic nature of the haul led to a number of theories. One theory suggested that the thieves were not sophisticated art connoisseurs, but common criminals who were working from a shopping list provided by a wealthy and scrupulous collector. This would explain why they seemed to know which rooms to go to, but not necessarily which paintings in those rooms were the most valuable. They were simply following orders. Another theory proposed that the thieves were local Boston gangsters, perhaps from one of the city's notorious Irish or Italian mob families. The art in this scenario was not stolen for its aesthetic value, but to be used as a bargaining chip, leveraged to get a fellow mobster out of prison. This theory was bolstered by the fact that the art world and the criminal underworld have often intersected in Boston. The FBI began a deep dive into the city's criminal networks. They interviewed mobsters, art dealers, and informants. The investigation became a long, slow journey into the shadowy world of organized crime, a world of unspoken codes, secret allegiances, and violent loyalties. The Gardner heist was no longer just an art crime. It was a mob mystery. The question was, which of Boston's notorious criminal figures had the audacity and the connections to pull off such a daring and high-profile job? The search for the stolen masterpieces had begun, a search that would lead investigators down a rabbit hole of intriguing suspects, tantalizing near misses, and a silence from the underworld that was as profound as the empty spaces on the museum's walls. In the years following the heist, the investigation into the Gardner robbery became one of the most complex and frustrating cases the FBI had ever undertaken. The city of Boston's criminal underworld was a tangled web of rival gangs, old loyalties, and a deep, abiding code of silence. The investigators were faced with a daunting task, trying to find 13 priceless works of art that had been swallowed by a world that did not give up its secrets easily. The early focus of the investigation was on the Boston mob. The FBI pursued numerous leads connected to both the Irish and Italian mafias. One prominent theory centered on a notorious local gangster and art thief named Miles J. Connor Jr. Connor was a charismatic and intelligent criminal, a kind of rock and roll art thief who was known for his audacious museum heists. At the time of the Gardner robbery, he was in prison, but many believed that he had masterminded the job from his cell, using his associates on the outside to carry it out. Connor himself has always played a coy game with investigators, sometimes hinting that he knows where the art is, other times denying any involvement. He has claimed that he could get the art back in exchange for his release from prison, but he has never delivered. Another major avenue of investigation focused on the criminal crew of a powerful and feared local mobster named Carmelo Merlino. Merlino's crew was known for its involvement in armored car robberies and other high-stakes crimes. The FBI came to believe that this crew, or a faction of it, was responsible for the heist. This theory gained significant traction in the late 1990s, when the FBI, as part of a separate investigation, managed to place bugs in Merlino's garage. On the tapes, Merlino and his associates were heard discussing the Gardner heist and talking about recovering the stolen paintings to collect the massive reward money. This led the FBI to zero in on a number of key suspects within Merlino's orbit. The most prominent of these were two men, Robert Bobby Guarente and Robert the Cook Gentile. Guarente was a seasoned, old-school mobster. Gentile was a lower-level associate from Connecticut. The FBI came to believe that Guarente had come into possession of at least some of the stolen art shortly after the heist and had passed it on to Gentile for safekeeping. Before he died, Guarente's own wife told the FBI that her husband had been involved in the Gardner heist and that he had given 2 of the stolen paintings to Gentile. When the FBI searched Gentile's home in Connecticut, they found a hidden ditch in his backyard. In the ditch, they found nothing, but they also found a list of the stolen Gardner paintings, along with their estimated black market value. Hidden in his home, Gentile has been subjected to intense scrutiny and pressure from the FBI for years. He has been sent to prison on unrelated gun charges, a move many see as an attempt to pressure him into talking, but he has steadfastly denied ever having the paintings or knowing where they are. He claims he was set up by Guarente's widow. The trail of suspects is a long and winding one, a who's who of the Boston underworld. There is David Turner, an associate of Carmelo Merlino, whose physical description matches one of the thieves. There is George Reisfelder, another associate, who also matched the description and died of a drug overdose a year after the heist. The FBI believes, with a high degree of confidence, that they have identified the 2 men who walked into the museum that night. But both men are now dead. In 2013, the FBI made a stunning public announcement. They stated that they knew who was responsible for the crime. They said the heist was the work of a criminal organization based in the Mid-Atlantic and New England, and that the art had been taken to Connecticut and Philadelphia in the years after the robbery, where it was offered for sale. But they did not name the thieves, and they admitted that they did not know where the art was now. The announcement was a strange and frustrating moment, a declaration of knowledge that led to no resolution. The fate of the 13 stolen works of art remains the greatest unsolved mystery in the art world. Have they been destroyed, damaged by years of improper storage? Are they hanging on the wall of a secret private collector, a modern-day Bond villain who commissioned the crime for their own private viewing pleasure? Or are they still being held somewhere, a hidden treasure waiting for the right moment to be used as a bargaining chip? The most likely scenario, and the one that is most heartbreaking for the art world, is that the paintings were stolen by criminals who had no understanding of their true value. They were not art lovers. They were thieves who saw the paintings as commodities, as bargaining chips. They likely had no idea how to care for them, how to store them, or how to sell them. The paintings are so famous that they are essentially worthless on the legitimate or even the black market. They are impossible to sell. It is very possible that the masterpieces, which had survived for centuries, were damaged or destroyed within years of the heist due to ignorance and neglect. The legacy of the Gardner heist is a profound one. It is a story of a shocking security failure, a reminder that even our most revered cultural institutions are vulnerable. In the wake of the heist, museums around the world completely overhauled their security systems, learning a hard lesson from the Gardners' tragic experience. But the deeper legacy is one of loss. The 13 stolen works are not just valuable objects. They are irreplaceable pieces of human history and culture. Vermeer's The Concert is considered by many to be the most valuable stolen object in the world. Its absence is a wound in the art world that will never heal. In the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum today, a strange and powerful memorial remains. In accordance with Isabella Stewart Gardner's will, which forbids any changes to the collection, the empty frames from which the masterpieces were cut still hang on the walls of the Dutch room. They are haunting, ghostly rectangles of empty space, serving as a permanent and poignant reminder of what was lost. They are placeholders for a treasure that has been gone for over 30 years, a symbol of a hope that has not yet been extinguished. The museum, along with the FBI, continues to offer a multi-million-dollar reward for any information leading to the recovery of the art. The case remains officially open, and the investigation continues, a quiet, patient search for a set of ghosts. The Gardner heist is a story with a simple beginning. Two men in police uniforms knocking on a door, and a profoundly complex and unresolved ending. It is a story about the intersection of high art and low crime, of beauty and brutality. It is a testament to the fact that some things, once lost, can never be replaced. We are left with the image of those empty frames, hanging in the quiet, dim light of the museum. They are a monument to a perfect crime, a crime where the thieves got away with it, but in doing so, stole something not just from a museum but from the world. The mystery of who they were and where they took their priceless loot has become Boston's greatest unsolved mystery. A story that is still being told in the hushed tones of the underworld and the hallowed halls of the art world. And the frames remain on the wall, waiting, a silent, hopeful testament to the idea that one day, the masterpieces might just come home. The great Canadian maple syrup heist. The crimes we have explored have been born of desperation, of malice, and of profound, tragic mystery. They are stories of darkness, of perpetrators who were either monstrously evil or chillingly competent. But there is another kind of crime, one that is not born of violence or terror, but of a sweet, sticky, and uniquely Canadian brand of ambition. It's a crime so audacious, so massive in scale, and so utterly bizarre that it sounds more like a punchline than a police file. For our final story, we travel not to a dark city street or a haunted house, but to a quiet, unassuming warehouse in rural Quebec. This is an era of global markets and strategic reserves. But the commodity at the heart of this story isn't oil or gold. It's maple syrup. This is the story of a small group of insiders who pulled off one of the largest and strangest agricultural heists in modern history. A crime that siphoned millions of dollars from a national institution, one barrel at a time. This is the story of the great Canadian maple syrup heist. Our story begins in the province of Quebec, the heartland of global maple syrup production. Quebec produces over 70% of the world's maple syrup, and the industry is a cornerstone of its culture and economy. To protect this vital industry from price fluctuations and market instability, a powerful organization was formed, the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers. The Federation acts as a kind of government-sanctioned cartel, a strategic reserve for maple syrup, much like OPEC is for oil. It sets prices, controls supply, and stores massive quantities of maple syrup in its warehouses across the province. This strategic reserve ensures that even in a bad harvest year, the world will not run out of Pancake's most famous companion. In 2011, the Federation was storing its reserve in a large, secure warehouse in a town called St. Louis de Blandford. The warehouse held over 16,000 barrels of maple syrup. Each barrel weighed over 600 pounds and was worth approximately $1,800. The total value of the syrup in that warehouse was close to $30 million. It was a liquid gold mine. The warehouse was supposed to be secure. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence. The doors were locked, and the barrels were meticulously inventoried. But like any fortress, its greatest weakness was the people who held the keys. The mastermind of the plot was a man named Abduction. Karen was not a hardened criminal mastermind. He was a man from the inside. His spouse was one of the owners of the warehouse that the Federation was renting. He had access, he had knowledge, and he had a deep-seated resentment for the Federation, which he saw as an overbearing and unfair monopoly. He saw the barrels of syrup not as a strategic reserve, but as a massive, unguarded piggy bank. Karen began to assemble a small, trusted crew. His primary partner was a man named Richard Valliers, a well-known, if somewhat shady, dealer who knew how to move large quantities of product on the black market. They also brought in a veteran truck driver named Raymond Valliers, no relation to Richard, and a handful of other insiders and local workers. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity and its audacity. They would not try to break into the warehouse and steal a few barrels in a smash and grab. That would be too noisy, too obvious. Instead, they would conduct a slow, patient, and almost invisible siphoning operation. They started in late 2011. Using Karen's access, they would enter the warehouse when no one was around. They would transport the full barrels of valuable, Federation-grade maple syrup to a remote sugar shack they had rented deep in the woods. At the sugar shack, they set up a clandestine bottling operation. They would empty the barrels of the high-quality syrup, and then, in a stroke of criminal genius, they would refill the barrels with cheap, low-grade syrup or, in some cases, just water. They would then transport the refilled, counterfeit barrels back to the main warehouse and place them back on the stacks, exactly where the original barrels had been. To the outside world, and to any casual inspector, everything looked perfectly normal. The inventory count would be correct. The barrels were all there. But inside, the liquid gold was being systematically replaced with worthless filler. Meanwhile, the real, high-quality syrup was being handled by Richard Valliers. He used his network of black market contacts to sell the stolen syrup to distributors in other Canadian provinces and even across the border in the United States. In states like Vermont and New Hampshire, he sold it at a significant discount compared to the Federation's official price, but it was still pure profit. The money began to roll in. For nearly a year, from late 2011 to the summer of 2012, this clandestine operation continued, completely undetected. The crew worked diligently, siphoning off barrel after barrel. It was the perfect crime happening in plain sight. They were not just stealing a product. They were stealing the very essence of the strategic reserve, replacing quality with a facade. They eventually stole nearly 10,000 barrels of maple syrup, almost two-thirds of the entire reserve stored at that location. The total value of the stolen syrup was over $18 million. The scheme was so successful, so audacious, that it likely would have continued for much longer, had it not been for a simple, routine inspection. In the summer of 2012, an inspector from the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers was conducting a routine inventory at the St. Louis de Blandford warehouse. As he was climbing up the massive stacks of barrels, he slipped and fell. The barrel he landed on felt strangely light, almost empty. It didn't have the solid, heavy feel of a 600-pound drum of syrup. Suspicious, he tapped on a few of the other barrels. Some of them sounded hollow. Others had developed rust on their lids, a sign that the contents might be water, not the thick, preservative syrup. He unscrewed the cap on one of the barrels and looked inside. It wasn't the rich, amber color of pure maple syrup. It was a pale, watery liquid. The alarm was raised immediately. The Federation launched a full-scale inspection of the entire warehouse. As they began to open barrel after barrel, the true scale of the heist was revealed. Thousands of barrels had been either emptied and refilled with water, or were completely missing. It was a catastrophic and deeply embarrassing discovery. The strategic reserve had been compromised from within. The Charité du Québec, the provincial police force, was called in, and one of the strangest and largest investigations in Canadian history began. They were not hunting for violent criminals or international spies. They were hunting for a gang of syrup thieves. the investigation quickly zeroed in on the insiders. The nature of the crime made it clear that it could not have been pulled off by outsiders. Abduction, the man with the keys, was the obvious primary suspect. The police began to follow the money trail, tracing the black market sales of the stolen syrup. The network of thieves, which had operated so smoothly when they were making money, began to fall apart under the pressure of the investigation. As the police began to make arrests, the suspects started to turn on each other, each one trying to cut a deal, each one pointing the finger at the others. Over the next few months, more than 24 people were arrested in connection with the heist. The police recovered a significant portion of the stolen syrup from various warehouses and bottling plants, but much of it had already been sold and had disappeared into the global food supply. The story of the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist became an international media sensation. The idea of a multi-million-dollar robbery involving Canada's most famous export was too strange and too charming to resist. It was a crime story that sounded like a quirky indie film, a tale of intrigue set in the quiet, pastoral world of sugar shacks and maple groves. But behind the charming headlines was a serious and sophisticated criminal enterprise. The thieves had exploited a system built on trust, and they had done it with a level of patience and ingenuity that was truly remarkable. The case was a wake-up call for the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, forcing them to completely overhaul their security and inventory systems. The trial of the main conspirators was a complex and lengthy affair. Abduction, the mastermind, and Richard Vallières, the black market dealer, were convicted, along with many of their accomplices. They were given prison sentences and ordered to pay millions of dollars in restitution. The Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist is a story that is unique in the annals of true crime. It is a crime with no violence, no weapons, no physical threat. The only victim was a large, powerful institution. And yet, it was one of the largest heists in modern history. A crime that required an incredible amount of planning, skill, and audacity. It is a story that could only have happened in Quebec, a place where maple syrup is not just a food product, but a part of the national identity, a resource so valuable that it needs its own strategic reserve. The case is a fascinating look into a world that most of us know nothing about. A world of syrup cartels, black markets, and a level of intrigue that would befit a story about diamonds or gold. It is also a deeply human story. It is a story about greed, resentment, and the temptation of an unguarded fortune. It shows how ordinary people, when faced with an extraordinary opportunity, can be capable of pulling off an extraordinary crime. The men who stole the syrup were not career criminals in the traditional sense. They were insiders, members of the community, who saw a weakness in the system and exploited it for all it was worth. The mystery of the syrup heist is not a whodunit. We know who did it. The mystery lies in the sheer, audacious simplicity of their plan, and the fact that they were able to get away with it for so long. It is a quiet reminder that sometimes the most effective crimes are not the ones that are loud and violent, but the ones that happen slowly, silently, and in plain sight, a drop at a time. The Great Reserve had been breached, not with a bang, but with a siphon. The trial of the men behind the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist was a spectacle that was as unusual as the crime itself. The courtroom in Quebec was filled not with talk of violence and mayhem, but with the esoteric language of the maple syrup industry. Discussions of grading systems, brix levels, and the subtle chemical differences between pure Quebec syrup and the cheap substitutes used to fill the barrels. It was a legal drama where the key evidence was not a weapon, but a hydrometer. The prosecution, led by the Charité du Québec, laid out the case with meticulous detail. They presented the testimony of the Federation inspectors who had discovered the tampered barrels. They brought in financial experts who had traced the complex web of black market sales from Richard Vallières' network to distributors across North America. And most importantly, they had the testimony of the conspirators themselves. Under the pressure of the investigation, the thieves' code of silence had completely disintegrated. Many of the lower-level players, the truck drivers and warehouse workers, had quickly cut deals with the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. They took the stand and described the entire operation from the inside, painting a vivid picture of the clandestine work at the remote sugar shack. They recounted the long nights spent pumping out the golden syrup, the heavy labor of refilling the barrels with water, and the constant fear of being discovered. Abduction, the disgruntled insider who masterminded the plot, was portrayed as a man driven by a deep-seated resentment of the Federation. He saw himself not as a common thief, but as a kind of folk hero, a Robin Hood of the Maple Groves, striking a blow against a powerful and oppressive monopoly. His defense argued that he was a man who felt squeezed by an unfair system and had simply taken what he believed was rightfully his. Richard Valliers, the charismatic black market dealer, was presented as the financial engine of the operation. He was the one with the connections, the one who knew how to turn the stolen syrup into millions of dollars in untraceable cash. He was a smooth operator who had built a career on the fringes of the legitimate market, and this was his biggest score. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the case was overblown, that it was essentially a business dispute, not a major criminal enterprise. They tried to portray their clients as small-time operators who had gotten in over their heads. But the sheer scale of the theft, nearly 10,000 barrels, worth over $18 million, made that argument a difficult one to sustain. This was not a minor case of pilfering. It was a systematic, large-scale fraud that had threatened the stability of an entire global market. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Abduction, Richard Valliers, and dozens of their accomplices were found guilty. The sentences were significant. Richard Valliers, considered one of the ringleaders, was sentenced to 8 years in prison and fined nearly $10 million. Abduction also received a prison sentence and a hefty fine. The message from the court was clear. A crime against maple syrup in Quebec was a crime against the province itself. The legacy of the great Canadian maple syrup heist is a fascinating and multi-layered one. On one level, it is a story that is almost comically Canadian, a crime that feels gentle and absurd compared to the violent heists and murders that usually capture the public imagination. The idea of a syrup cartel and a strategic maple reserve sounds like something out of a sketch comedy show. The crime has been the subject of numerous documentaries, podcasts, and even a segment on the Netflix series Dirty Money, all of which have played up the quirky, almost charming nature of the story. But behind the quirky headlines lies a serious and sophisticated criminal operation. The heist was a masterclass in insider crime. It exploited a system built on trust and a lack of rigorous oversight. The thieves understood the rhythms of the warehouse, the weaknesses in the inventory system, and the human element of security. Their plan was patient, methodical, and, for a very long time, perfect. The case served as a massive wake-up call for the Federation of Quebec maple syrup producers. In the aftermath of the heist, they completely overhauled their security protocols. Warehouses were fitted with more sophisticated alarm systems and surveillance cameras. The inventory process, which had once relied on simple counts, was replaced with a more rigorous system of weighing and testing the contents of the barrels. The era of the honor system was over. The strategic reserve is now protected with the kind of security usually reserved for gold bullion. The heist also shone a bright light on the strange and powerful world of the Quebec maple syrup industry. It revealed to the world a system where a single organization controls the price and supply of a global commodity, a system that inevitably creates a thriving black market for those willing to operate outside the rules. The case was not just about a theft. It was about the tensions between a regulated, controlled market and the forces of free enterprise, albeit in its most illegal form. The story is also a deeply human one. It is a tale of greed, of resentment, of ordinary people who saw a chance to get rich and took it. It is a reminder that the most significant crimes are not always committed by hardened criminals, but by people you would never suspect. The neighbor, the coworker, the insider who knows the system better than anyone else. Today, the stolen syrup is long gone, consumed in pancakes and pastries around the world. The men who stole it have served their time or are still paying off their massive fines. The warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford is once again full of secure, properly inventoried barrels of maple syrup. But the story of the great Canadian maple syrup heist endures. It is a crime that is unique in the annals of true crime history, a story that is both absurd and brilliant, both charming and deeply serious. It is a tale that proves that a fortune can be stolen not with a gun, but with a pump. and that the most audacious heists can happen in the quietest and most unexpected of places. We are left with the image of that remote sugar shack, deep in the Quebec woods, where a small group of men worked through the night, not cooking meth or forging money, but patiently siphoning off barrel after barrel of liquid gold. It is a crime that smells not of gunpowder or fear, but of sweet, sticky, and profoundly illegal maple syrup. It is a uniquely Canadian story, a quiet reminder that even in the most peaceful of industries, where there is great value, there will always be someone willing to find a way to take it. The Great Reserve had been breached, not with a bang, but with a whisper, and the world of breakfast has never been quite so dramatic.